In this installment of Washington Legal Foundation's Legally Brief, we are joined by Hollingsworth LLP partner Stephen Klein, who will share with you some thoughts on a recent medical device liability court ruling. The case, Capps versus Biosense Webster, involved whether a device manufacturer can be liable when the device is reprocessed and injures a patient. Mr. Klein, in this case, the plaintiff alleged a litany of normal products liability claims, but the key question here was not normal. It was the question of the reprocessing. How did the court handle that with regards to proof and responsibility?
Thanks, Glenn. That's a great question. The plaintiff did assert the traditional litany of product liability claims here, but what's unique in this context is the fact that one of the defendants, the original manufacturer, was sought to be held liable for a product that arguably was no longer its own. Let me explain very briefly what reprocessing is. It involves medical devices, typically such as catheters, laparoscopic equipment, endoscopic tools, and if a reprocessor is able to establish to FDA satisfaction that the device can be cleaned and sterilized adequately so that it can be reused a second time, it's entitled to reprocess the device and resell it. And typically, the arrangement is with a particular hospital or clinic. The reprocessor will collect the devices to be reprocessed, will reclean them, repackage them, put on its own label and instructions for use, and return the devices to the hospital from which they were collected. In the Capps case, the device at issue was a catheter, specifically a lasso catheter, which is a catheter with a wire loop coming out of the end in the shape of a lasso. And it was used for a heart procedure that Mr. Capps was undergoing. During the procedure, the wire lasso got caught on Mr. Capps' mitral valve, and as the catheter was being pulled out of his heart, the wire loop came out of the catheter and remained in the patient. The doctors ultimately were able to extract the catheter, but in doing so, they caused damage to the mitral valve, and Mr. Capps, unfortunately, required at that point open heart surgery and the installation of a prosthetic mitral valve. The reprocessing context really did have an important impact on the nature of the claims, the way they were argued, and the way the court addressed them. So let's take those in turn. Starting with a manufacturing defect claim, the plaintiff asserted manufacturing defect claims against both the original manufacturer and the reprocessor. The defect that was at issue here was the fact that there was a smear of polyurethane glue found on the catheter body itself. Polyurethane glue is what was used to install and adhere the wire loop to the catheter body. And the fact that there was a smear of polyurethane glue on the catheter body itself, the plaintiff argued, was evidence of a manufacturing defect. The problem for the plaintiff was that he was unable to establish when the manufacturing defect took place, whether it took place during the original manufacturing process or whether it took place during reprocessing. The plaintiff attempted to utilize a res ipsa loquitur theory, and the court rejected that fact with respect to the original manufacturer for two reasons. It found that there were at least two events after the device left the possession of the original manufacturer, during which time the condition of the device could have materially changed. And that was the use of the device in the first patient, and then secondly, of course, the reprocessing procedure itself. So based on this ruling, it looks like res ipsa loquitur is not a theory that plaintiffs will be able to utilize against original manufacturers. However, the res ipsa loquitur theory can be used against the reprocessor because the device will be in the same condition when it's supposedly failed as the time it left the possession of the reprocessor. Turning to warning defects, this claim really was significantly impacted by the reprocessing context. As I mentioned, the reprocessor put its own label and instructions for use on the reprocessed device, and in order to get around the fact that it was not the original manufacturer's warning that the doctors using the reprocessed device would have seen, the plaintiff attempted to argue that the original manufacturer should have issued a Dear Doctor letter to the medical community, which would have been seen by the doctors using the reprocessed device. In response, the original manufacturer tried to argue that it was not the quote-unquote manufacturer of the reprocessed device at all, and therefore had no duty to warn at all. The original manufacturer analogized itself to a brand name drug manufacturer. As you may know, there's theory out there about trying to hold the brand name drug manufacturer liable for injuries caused by the generic drug equivalent. And most courts, as you know, hold that the brand name manufacturer cannot be held liable in such situations because it's not the brand product that's at issue. The court in the CAPS case rejected that analogy because, unlike the brand name drug context, the device at issue here arguably was the same product as that manufactured by the original manufacturer. So the court rejected a per se finding that the original manufacturer is not a manufacturer of the reprocessed device. It also, by the way, found that the reprocessor could be a manufacturer. So you have two companies that potentially could be operable manufacturers of the reprocessed device. Because of the reprocessing arrangement I alluded to earlier, the contract with the hospital at issue here and the reprocessor contained a clause stating that title to the reprocessed device would remain with the hospital at all times, such that the reprocessor never takes title to the device during the reprocessing process. The reprocessor tried to argue that, therefore, it was not the manufacturer based on this contract language, and the court rejected that theory, finding that the indicia of manufacturing associated with the reprocessor, i.e. the fact that it repackaged the device, put its own label and warning on there, overcame the contract language to the contrary.
Why was it significant in this case that the device was labeled single use? How did that play into the court's reasoning and ruling?
Well, the FDA permits an original manufacturer to indicate whether its device will be for single use or whether it can be reused. And as you mentioned in this case, the original manufacturer labeled its device as single use only. The original manufacturer tried to use that fact as sort of a magic bullet to insulate itself from all liability, and the court rejected that argument largely on the grounds that reprocessing is something that's expressly sanctioned and even encouraged by FDA. As long as the reprocessor can establish that the device is capable of being adequately cleaned and sterilized and reused, the FDA will encourage reprocessing to take place. So therefore, the fact that a device was labeled as single use is not enough to inoculate the original manufacturer from all use. However, the court did also find that the original manufacturer of a single-use device has no duty to warn of the dangers of reprocessing, which is something that the plaintiff tried to argue. The warning that the plaintiff essentially was advocating was, hey, we put a single-use warning on our product, yet it's possible that some company out there is going to ignore that. And the court was not willing to find that that was an obligated warning under state law.
Now, this is one of the first rulings in this sort of area. Why does this ruling have significance sort of beyond just the two parties at interest here?
Well, this was really the first case to systematically address the allocation of liability between an original manufacturer and a reprocessor of a reprocessed device. And this is a context I think we're going to be seeing more and more of in court as time goes on. There's a lot of pressure, as we all know, to reduce medical care costs. There's a lot of efforts at the regulatory level, at the government reform level, to find ways to minimize healthcare costs, which are increasing. And reprocessed devices is really an important, and in fact an increasingly important method of doing so. The catheter at issue in this case costs something like $1,500 when new. It's only $700 reprocessed, so there really are significant savings. And in fact, the reprocessor in this case, a company called Ascent, advertises in its promotional materials that in the year 2009 alone, it saved its clients something like $170 million from reprocessed devices. There's a second important element of this case that will have significant use and benefit in future drug and device cases, and that is that the court took a fairly expansive view of Buckman preemption, which of course is the doctrine that a fraud on the FDA claim is preempted by federal law It's the sole province of the FDA. And in this case, the plaintiff attempted to argue that the reprocessor had improperly gotten improper authorization from FDA for its reprocessed device, and the court rejected all the claims that depended on that theory on the grounds of Buckman preemption. So it took a pretty expansive view of Buckman preemption, which is something that will be very helpful.
Mr. Klein and Hollingsworth LLP colleague Andrew Rices recently authored a Washington Legal Foundation working paper on the CAPS case, which can be downloaded from WLF's website.